Hi Rebecca, here's your feedback on the mock exam that you did just before the Christmas holidays. You scored 3 out of 4 on this first question. Question B was false. He's not happy to help with his homework, and the correct other answer is C. As a boy, Jay Rayner worried about handing in his homework on Monday mornings. But 3 out of 4 is a good start. So if we move on to question 2, where you're asked to write a summary of the differences between Eddie and Henry. Oops. You've made some interesting points where you've said that Eddie's father thinks that his son is more intelligent than him, and you've given a quote of where he blames himself, and then Henry is desperate to get his father's attention. You've said that Henry feels he's been uncared for, and you've mentioned how the living conditions are starting to affect him. You've given a couple of good quotes. Our bread is nearly black and our beds are stuffed with chaff. And then you've given some good inference here that you believe that Eddie has a better life with his caring father, warm, inviting home, whereas Henry lives in a much harsher time, doesn't have the luxury of having a warm, cosy bed and a loving father to help with his education. So as far as it goes, that's not a bad answer. So if we look at the mark scheme, if we look at level 2, it says show some interpretation from one or both texts. Well, we have looked at both texts. Attempts some inference from one or both texts. Well, here we've got the inference from both texts. Select some appropriate references or textual details. Again, we've got a couple of quotes in here. We've got the ones here about the food and the bed. And we've got where he's blaming himself for Eddie being the monster that he's created, basically. So you've used some text, some quotes from the text, and you've given statements to show the differences between the texts. I think if we were to go up a band, you wouldn't have needed to included some more points and made more inferences from the text with more quotes. You could have talked about the different ways that they talk to the respective parents, that Eddie's quite cheeky and makes fun of his dad, which shows the loving relationship that they have together, whereas Henry, when he's writing to his dad, his language is quite formal, showing respect, but possibly also that he's a little bit frightened of his dad, maybe. He doesn't want to be too informal in case he upsets or annoys his dad. You could also have mentioned the fact that, so I think for this question it's 4 out of a possible 8 marks. Moving on to question 3, where you're asked to analyse the language that Henry uses to try to influence his father. I think this bit here that you've crossed out actually would have been a good way to start it off, because he is trying to convince or persuade his father to let him come home. However, you've started with the importance of using code so that Mr. Smith won't be able to understand what's really being said. I'm not sure that that's really relevant to the question and how he's using language to influence his father. You go on to say that he's extremely biased towards the boarding school he inhabits, and clearly states the living conditions to be awful. You've used subject terminology here, short sentences, and given the example of our bread is nearly black to emphasise his point of view, presumably about the poor living conditions. You've said that he clearly craves the attention of his father and tries everything in his power to convince his father. To convince his father of what, though? Your quote is that he'd rather be obliged to work all his life than to remain here. But you've not really said what it is that you think he's trying to convince his father of. And then you've gone on to say it looks to you like a desperate cry for help to the one person that he can trust. Now, this is a 12-mark question, so you need to give at least 4 points about how he's used the language to try to influence his father. I think you've given 2 or 3 examples, so you need to add a couple more in there. And if we look at the mark scheme, if we look at band 2, it says show some understanding of language. And the bullet point 1, attempts to comment on the effects of language. You've done some of that, so I would say you've attempted to comment on the effects of some of the language. You've chosen some appropriate textual detail, but again, I think you could have added some more, because you need to include at least one quote for every point that you make. And you've used some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. So the terminology that you've used is accurate and appropriate, but you've not used it as often as you would need to gain the higher marks. Because if we look at the level 3, you need to be explaining clearly the effects of the writer's choices of language and making clear and accurate use of subject terminology. So I don't think we've met the criteria there. I think we do need to stick to this level 2 here. And there were several good examples of language that you could use. I mean, he's used the direct address, so you and your, to try and get his dad on side, to make him realise that he's talking directly to him. He's used repetition of my dear father several times throughout the letter, which could emphasise how close he feels to his dad and how much he's missing him, how homesick he's feeling. Or, looking to go up to the band 4, you could say that this could have been a deliberate ploy on Henry's behalf to say his dear father, because clearly if they've not seen each other for 2 years, the relationship's not that close. So is he really over-exaggerating the nearness of them to try and appeal to his dad and get round his dad? He also uses a simile, or you could say even hyperbole, when he says they're treated more like bears than Christians. Again, showing how badly he thinks that they've been treated worse than animals. And there's also the example of emotive language where he says, but I hope, my dear father, you will let me come home at Christmas, that we may once more meet again alive, if God permit me to live as long. So he's definitely trying to pull on his father's heartstrings there. And again, it's emotive language or even exaggeration, hyperbole. So it's these kind of things that you need to be adding to get you up into that band 3 and possibly even the band 4. So I think for this one, it's going to be a 5 out of the possible 12 marks. So if we look now at question 4, where you're asked to refer to the whole of source A together with source B, the father's letter to the family friend. I don't think you've read this little bit properly, because you have clearly talked about source A, but when you've talked about source B, you've not realised that it's talking about the second letter in the 2 parts of that source B. So it's the letter that the father's written to the family friend about Henry, not the letter that Henry's written to his dad. And that's because it's asking you to compare the attitudes and perspectives of both fathers to education and parenting. So unfortunately, that is going to limit your grade to the band 1. So if we have a look at how you've started off anyway, you said Eddie's father's written the article. It was difficult for him to help his son even though he wanted to. And it's making him feel inferior to his son, and then you've given a quote here. And then unfortunately here we move on to talking about the conditions at the time. And unfortunately a lot of this isn't relevant to the question because you've not actually picked that up from the letter that you've asked to look at. It's more for assumptions that you're making from Henry's letter to his dad. And then this is clearly taken from the letter from Henry to his dad. And again, you're saying here it gives an indication of how differently children are educated today than 100 years ago. That's not relevant. You're asked to look at the attitudes and perspectives of the 2 fathers. You've said here Eddie's father is extremely supportive of his son, which is good. again, we've reverted back to Henry's letter. And then here it's generalisation, not information taken from the sources. So unfortunately, as I've said, it is going to limit you to the band 1, because we've got to make simple cross-reference of ideas and perspectives. Unfortunately, you've not done that because you've used the wrong text. It's also asking you to look at the methods that the writers use to get their points over. You've not really done that anyway, so it'd be looking at things like Eddie's dad uses humour to get his point across when you're looking at the quote that you used. Where is it? Who needs teachers to humiliate you when your son can do it effectively? So he's making a bit of a joke there and using a rhetorical question. So that's one of the methods that he uses to get his point over. You could talk about the different language that they use. That Jay's is more informal and chatty, whereas the language that Henry's dad uses is very formal. Eddie's dad is quite proud of him, thinks that he's doing really well and so much better than he did when he was at school, whereas Henry's dad says in the letter to his friend that he's picked up that both boys could spell when they went away to school, but he's noticed spelling mistakes in Henry's letter to him. So there were lots of different things that you could look at. And then going back to the bullet points, make simple references of textual details from one or both texts. Well, again, because this is a 16-mark question, you need to identify at least 6, if not more, points, and you need to use a quote for each point that you make. So I think this is going to have to be 2 out of the possible 16 marks, because you've not looked at the right text and you've not identified the writer's methods. Overall, that gives you a score of 14 out of 40, which, considering this is the first time that we've looked at a mock for the paper 2, it's not too bad a score. And hopefully I've given you some ideas of how you can improve it in future. Just you need to make sure that you're reading the question clearly and carefully and answering the question that you've been asked. Don't digress and start putting your own ideas in that are not relevant from the text, and make sure that you include plenty of quotes and subject terminology where possible. But everything's still to play for. You're doing well. We've got 5 months now to box everything off. Just make sure that you're attending all your lessons. If you can't attend, try and catch up on the work that you've missed on Moodle before the next lesson, because the work does tend to build on. And make sure that you hand in all your homework completed, because that gives me an idea of how you're doing and also gives you information on things that you need to improve on. But keep up the good work.